Today I'm going to share one of my favorite soup recipes with you. It's just really tasty, the perfect thing to eat on a cold winter's day like it is today in Brasstown. When I was growing up, Granny was really into couponing. You may remember, there's still people today that do it, but in the 80s there was this real craze of couponing and saving box tops and things like that, and you could save so many and turn them in and get maybe a cookbook or some kind of kitchen utensil or something like that. Of course, there was the green stamps in those days. I bet a bunch of you remember those. So all those kind of little gimmick things Granny would do. She was really into it. And what she would do is she would get enough points or coupons or box tops or whatever it was while she was couponing to get those free items, and she would keep working at it until she got, most of the time, 3, sometimes 4 items. She would get, if she got 4, then it meant one was for her, one was for me, one was for Steve, and one was for Paul. So by the time that we got married, she had all these stacks of stuff that she'd got free over the years for each of us to take to our households, our new households. By the time I got married, she had done that for sure. So some of my recipe books and things that I have today, they have actually my little handwriting in them where I wrote my name back then with my maiden name, of course never dreaming that I would be a Presley someday. My little, trying to write really fancy cursive, which I've never had good handwriting, so it was especially pitiful in those days. But anyway, one of those cookbooks is the Betty Crocker's Creative Recipes with Bisquick. Now, Granny never really used Bisquick a lot. I don't remember her, if we had pancakes and stuff like that, she made them from scratch. Her and Pat both did. So I don't remember how she ended up with the Bisquick one. But once she brought it home, or once it arrived in the mail in those days, and I looked through it, this was at the time when I was just beginning to learn how to cook, and Granny would let me cook whatever I wanted to cook. And it had just such exotic, to me, exotic things in it. There was no just taters and beans, which is what we ate a whole lot of. There was all these fancy sounding recipes. So I tried lots of them in those days, and liked most all of them. It has some like most cookbooks, entrees and then desserts, and of course it has the pancakes and that kind of stuff in it. But one of the ones that I made in those days that I continue to make ever since then, since I first started making it as a young girl, is called Cabbage Patch Stew. Now there's lots of variations of this out there. And over the years I've kind of varied it to myself. So it's one of those recipes where you kind of know the basics and then you kind of make it and you figure out how it works best for your family. The base of it is according to the recipe, and I will put the recipe link down below so that you can go see the original recipe. But the base of it is hamburger, is ground beef. You could use ground turkey, you could use chicken, you could use deer meat. Venison is especially good in it. You could leave the meat out. I've done that. I've made it when I used very little meat. Maybe I just had a little small, waste not, want not. Even if I have a little bit left over from some kind of dish I'm making, I put that little bit of meat in the freezer. So sometimes I have little bitty pieces, so I might put that in it and have mostly the cabbage and the onions and stuff and not so much meat. But that's the main base of it. It also takes, as you might have guessed with the recipe, the title, Cabbage Patch Stew, cabbage. So I think the recipe actually calls for 1½ cups. I usually use more than that because we like cabbage. It calls for 2 onions sliced thinly. The onions are really good in it. And it calls for celery, ½ cup. I think it's ½ cup of celery. And these are all adjustable, as I said, to your personal taste. Now, lots of times I don't have celery. It's just not something that I keep on hand. I do have it today, so I'm going to use it. I had some left over from the holidays from the making dressing, cornbread dressing, so I'm going to use it. But a lot of times I leave it out, and it's still a really good stew, really hearty. Another thing that it uses is a can of beans. So kidney beans, pinto beans, white kidney beans, northern beans, any of those things, well, even black beans, whatever your favorite bean is, that would work just fine. I've used them all over the years. I've used a variety of them. The best thing, of course, is if you've got some beans you made yourself. Sometimes when we have soup beans and stuff like that, I try to freeze them in the leftovers in little containers like what a can would be, and then I have those on hand to use. Those are by far, that's the best thing to put into the stew. But if you have to buy a can, that works too. The other thing it calls for is a can of stewed tomatoes. Well, in the beginning, way back then, I can't remember if I actually had stewed tomatoes, if Granny bought me some, but more than likely I used what I'm using today, which is our canned tomatoes. We can tomatoes every year, so I always have canned tomatoes, and I use just a quart of tomatoes. The recipe, I think, is for 16 ounces, so I guess that's about the same. But so I just use home canned, but of course you could use your personal. If you buy from a store, you could use whatever brand you prefer, whatever. If you like them crushed or if you like them whole, whatever, it would work well for this recipe. It's just one of those kind of recipes that you can kind of mold to make it your own as you go. It takes a cup of water. Sometimes I add more water. I'm one of those people that like my soups and my stews and my beans and all those things. I like them brothy. I like that pot liquor, we would call it, instead of the thickness. Now there are people that like thicker stuff, so that might need to be adjusted. As far as the seasoning, the only seasoning it calls for, the original recipe, is salt and pepper and chili powder. Now that's, again, you can change that to fit whatever you want. I've added garlic before, I've added oregano, just whatever strikes my fancy, but just that basic chili powder, salt and pepper is really good. But you could, and I've seen other people make this recipe, very similar recipe, very popular recipe, it's out there, and they leave the chili powder out. They don't like the chili powder. So again, that's just up to your personal preference for sure. Now you might be thinking, well, yeah, that all sounds great, but what in the world does that have to do with Bisquick? Where's the Bisquick, since it's a Bisquick recipe? Well, the Bisquick part comes in as the original recipe shares the dumplings. It has dumplings, so it shares a Bisquick dumpling recipe with this recipe, and then once the stew is completed, you whip up that Bisquick dumplings and drop them on top and then let them cook. The first time probably that I made them years ago when I was a young girl, I probably did make the dumplings, but I must have quickly realized that we didn't care for them. So all these years later, I've not made the dumplings in probably 20 years now. But we like to eat this. It goes perfectly with a cake of cornbread, fresh out of the oven, goes so good with that. It also goes good just with crackers. So if you're a cracker fan, I'm a saltine cracker fan, so it goes really good with those. So I don't make the dumplings anymore, but that's where the Bisquick part come in. Was from that recipe, and when I link below to the original recipe, I will also you'll be able to see those dumpling recipes. So if you want to go ahead and do that part. So I've had my ground beef browning while we've been talking. So now I've got everything chopped up. I've got my cabbage and my celery and my onions. So now we're going to move over to the stove and I'm going to start putting the stew together. So I have my ground beef browned, and now I'm going to add my vegetables. I'm going to go ahead and add our onions, and you can chop up your onions. You can leave them in the, like it said, slice thinly. I've done it both ways over the years. Either way, whatever kind of texture of onions in your soup and stews that you like is what you should do. Add our cabbage in. Give it a good stir. And I usually like to let this cook for about 10 minutes. I'll put a lid on it so that some of the moisture begins to come out of the onions and the cabbage as well. So we'll let that cook about 10 minutes. So our mixture has been cooking about 10 minutes, beginning to turn brown kind of around the edges and of the vegetables, I mean. Getting some brown on the onions and a little bit on the cabbage. And now it's just as simple as adding all the other ingredients. So I'm going to add our 1 cup of water, our chili powder and salt and pepper, tomatoes. I love opening a jar of tomatoes that we canned. It's like when I open them and I look at that beautiful redness, it's almost like I can feel the hot sun on the day that we picked them. Maybe even smell the greenhouse the day I planted them. Feel the sunshine on my arms, you know, out in the garden in the heat of the summer. And then remember the joy of putting them up and Seeing those beautiful red jars sitting on my table at the end of a long day's work, so rewarding. Seems like when you can stuff, all that ends up, a little bit of that day and those memories end up in your food, at least for me. So now we're going to add our beans, and you don't want to drain the beans. You want to add the water, the liquid that comes in the beans, and I'm using white kidney beans today is all I had on hand. You could use, as I said, pintos, black beans, kidney beans, Great Northerns, whatever bean you prefer. It smells so good already and looks so good. It's such a hearty meal for a cold day of winter. So I'm going to let it come back to a low simmer and let it simmer, oh, I don't know, about 10 minutes, 10 or 15 more minutes, just very low so that all those flavors can marry together. And then we'll be ready to eat some. I have some for my dinner today. So my stew is ready, the Cabbage Patch stew is ready just in time for me to eat dinner. I love days like this where I can get supper over early in the morning. This afternoon, me and Corey are going to be doing wedding stuff, so we have a full day ahead of us. So this is good that I've already got Matt's supper ready, and I even get to eat some of it for dinner. So when you make the stew, it freezes really well. So if you're worried about it making too much, if you're just, your family's not as large as ours, it freezes well. We typically eat it for a day or two, or 3, and then if it's not all gone, I will freeze it in small size containers, and then Matt takes that for his lunch, which works out really well. So it does freeze well. As far as how to eat it, I'm just eating mine with crackers today, right now. I do love it with cornbread, but I'm not going to make cornbread today just because I've got such a busy day. And I like to eat sour cream with mine, so I've got a dollop of sour cream. You could put cheese on it, whatever how you prefer to eat it, for sure. So I'm one of those people that like to pile it up on top of my cracker to get my first bite. You can see the beans and the cabbage and the meat and also the onions. So tasty. Of course, I need some of that sour cream to go with it. I have to get me some of that. Very good. Very hearty and rich for a cold winter's day like today. Very comforting to me because, as I said, I've been making this since I was a young girl in Granny's kitchen. I don't even think she makes it today, but when I was growing up, I was the one that made it there. And of course, once I was married, I began to make it for my own family. So it's got all those wonderful comfort type feelings for me, but it's also very hearty and good. So I bet that you've got a variation of this recipe, and if you do, I hope you'll leave a comment and share it with us. Maybe use a different kind of meat, maybe use not just cabbage, maybe you add some peppers, maybe you add some zucchini, maybe it's something different, but kind of still the heartiness of the cabbage, the onions, and the meat base. So please leave a comment and tell me about your version of Cabbage Patch Stew, and if you try this version, I know you'll like it as much as we do. I hope you'll continue to drop back by often as we celebrate Appalachia, which includes a lot of memories and food ways like the Cabbage Patch Stew that I learned how to make as a girl in Granny's kitchen and I'm still making today.